right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Trending Echoes, brought to you by Trends Research and Advisory. I'm your host, Omar, and we're here at COP28 in the beautiful city of Dubai. Our guest today joins us all the way from Addis Ababa, and we have right here in the studio Mr. Francis Aoubi. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Omar. Nice to meet you.
It's an absolute pleasure. How's your experience, first of all, now in Dubai?
It's been great so far. It's been lovely. Lots of vibrant people, lots of energetic people about climate and other development issues. So awesome.
Well, listen, I'm glad you like it. You have such value that you bring to the table and such amazing insight and information. Maybe we can convince you to shift from Addis Ababa to Dubai. Is that possible?
Well, there are lots of possibilities, so I wouldn't rule that out.
All right. We'll see. Now, Francis, a few things that we want to touch on, and I'm very excited to discuss a little bit more about the actual opportunities that are available in Africa. Africa has always been known to be, for the lack of better words, a gold mine of resources. But at the same time, that is a cause for a lot of conflict, challenges, also let's call it. So let's start by talking about some of the opportunities. And as an economist, what are some of the opportunities available for investors today when it comes to all things sustainability, climate change, and the future of renewable energy?
Thank you very much. I think there are lots of opportunities on the African continent with regards to opportunities in climate change and sustainability and issues like that. So if you take a look, for example, at Nigeria, Nigeria is blessed with lots of natural resources, lots of untapped natural resources. A lot of focus goes on the oil, the crude oil, which typically tends to be the cash cow, where it's drilled out and then sent out, sold out, and then it's been imported again as finished product. However, there are lots of other natural resources that Nigeria has. There are lots of natural resources that the DRC has, Democratic Republic of Congo, and which has led to also conflict as well. But looking at it from the opportunity perspective, one of it which I think is good for investors is renewable energy with regards to solar energy, because there is so much untapped solar energy potential on the African continent. Looking at it from North Africa down to the Sahel region, looking at West Africa, Central, down to Southern Africa, there's so much untapped potential that if investors, be it the government, private sectors, foreign investors, if they can tap at solar energy, one, it would be a good return on investment. Another aspect being that it's renewable because it's directly from the sun. So the cost would be in terms of fixing of the solar panels and all of that, and of course transporting the energy generated. But that would be a very good opportunity for all involved, the local communities that would benefit from it, the investors who would get returns on investment, and even governments, because most governments are looking at how to cater for their energy needs. And currently there's a huge shortage of energy needs. Take, for example, in South Africa over the past couple of months, even in the past year, so there's been this electricity shortage where basically it's been rationed based on power cuts. You have certain hours where there's electricity, certain hours where there isn't electricity. So these issues, I think, for one main aspect I would touch on would be solar energy in Africa. I think it's an untapped potential. With regards to some of the challenges which I think are very well known, however, there are lots of nuances to them. The ability to manage our resources has proved to be more of a challenge than a blessing. So there's this term, the Dutch disease, which means that a country discovers a certain natural resource, especially extractive resources, they tap it, and then once it begins to give them revenue, they isolate other industries. So they just focus on that industry, and then that sidelines other sectors of the economy. And typically these extractive industries are very susceptible to the global economy. So as markets rise and fall, say the oil prices falls, that means it affects the budget of that country, because most times the budget is based off of revenue from these extractive industries. However, if resource management looks at it from a different lens, how can we harness this in a sustainable way? How can we harness these resources to ensure that it's inclusive? So not just the elites benefiting from it, not just maybe one region or one ethnic group benefiting from it, but the whole country benefiting from it. I'll give two examples again. In the DRC, there's the Lake Kivu region. 4 countries have vested interest in this region. The Democratic Republic of Congo itself, you've got Rwanda, you've got Uganda, and you've got Burundi. All these countries have different interests because it's a resource-rich part of the world, not just Africa. It's very resource rich.
Right.
And most times, if you check many smartphones you might come across, there's a high percentage that some percent of that smartphone comes from resources from that region.
Wow.
However, it has been plagued by violent conflict, very deadly and violent conflict. And the collateral here being the people from that region. They have suffered the most from it. So I think this plays into how we manage our resources. And I'll just give one example of how proper resource management is also being done in Africa, because it's not all bleak. Botswana, which is rich in gold and diamonds, has realized that these resources aren't infinite. So there's an end date. It could be in the next 20, 30 years, but there's an end date.
Sure.
So they have started looking at sustainable ways to tap into these extractive industries, because the gold and diamond industry is very extractive. And not just that, it tends to use lots of child labor, lots of unpaid labor, and lots of forced labor as well. So they're looking at how can this be done sustainably? How can we ensure that the revenue is spread across the country? It's benefiting everyone. So Botswana is a case study of a successful resource management. Of course, there are other case studies we can look at, but Botswana is one that is a successful African case study, which I think other countries can emulate.
Right. Now, I do want to backtrack just a little bit. We were talking about some of the opportunities,
Right.
being able to harness all the sun power that we can get through solar, obviously. Why hasn't that been done? If the opportunity is there, you're talking about great returns on investment, the ability to have so many people benefit from it. Why hasn't it been done?
So I think a couple of reasons. There's a political reason, because typically governments tend to come and go. So say every 4 years or 8 years, depending on what the term limits are. And sometimes it might, someone might say I'm being unfair to the governments or to politicians. However, sometimes the politicians are self-seeking. So they only look for what they can do within their term limit. So if it's a 4-year term, 8-year term, they're only looking at that.
Right.
They're not looking at, okay, if I start this investment now, it would not reap benefits in 8 years, but say in 15, 20 years,
Correct.
it would reap benefits.
Sure.
Most times, political leaders, political actors are not looking at that. They're looking for what can get them a re-election.
Right.
So I think that's one of the challenges. The other one, which is a big challenge, is the financial aspects.
Sure.
Because most times capital inflow in Africa tends to be very, very low. If you look at foreign direct investment received in Africa, the whole of Africa received, I think, under $90 billion in 2022, I believe, 2021, 2022.
$90 billion towards what?
Towards foreign direct investment for the whole continent.
Okay.
When you compare that figure to other countries, Asia, for developing Asia, what's considered developing Asia, excluding China and some countries, received over...
Wait. Developing countries, including China? So
No, excluding China.
Oh, excluding. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
All
So
right.
developing Asia, which tends
Right.
to exclude China, and I think Singapore and some of the more developed...
But are we considering China as a developing country in this conversation?
Well, I think China is at a crossroads from, it's not developing, of course, but it's not fully developed. So I think it's at that crossroads where it's perhaps the only one in that on its own.
Sure.
Yeah, so maybe we need to coin a new term for China. However, the developing Asia region received over $683 billion.
Wow.
In terms of foreign direct
compared to the 90.
Yes, compared to Africa, which received under $90 billion.
Right.
So foreign direct investment in Africa has been really low. And I think for a lot of investors, they're thinking about, okay, instability. That's when most times they hear about Africa, they think about, oh, instability, would my investment be safe? Well, that's a valid challenge, or that's a valid concern. For sure. However, I do think that looking beyond that, there are lots of investment destinations in Africa.
Sure.
Because Africa is a huge continent with huge potentials. So I think the financial aspects, meaning that most investors are hesitant, even sometimes domestic investors are hesitant. So I think to address the issue of investor confidence, I think a lot of governments, and of course perhaps the African Union can spearhead this since it's the bloc for the continent, to ensure that there are business-friendly policies, to ensure that investments are safeguarded, because most investors are thinking about return on investment. So is it going to be safeguarded? And especially for infrastructural investment, how would that be protected? Because nobody wants to invest in a place where it could be destroyed by, say, maybe conflict. And then everything goes down the drain. So I think these are two of the biggest challenges. And there are lots of other challenges, some of them very multi-layered. But I think the political aspect with a bit of a short-sightedness and the financial aspect as well, I think have been reasons why we haven't been able to tap into this very, very valid potential we've got.
Certainly. Now, you were also talking about the resources available in certain places across Africa. We know that there are plenty of resources. And we were also talking about China. We do also understand that China does control a lot of the resources that are available, especially when it comes to all the minerals that go into, as you mentioned, cell phones, batteries for EVs, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
Why is it that we cannot see African governments or entities actually controlling their own resources?
So that has been a very big issue, I would say, since the independence wave. So dating back to the 50s and 60s when a lot of African countries started getting independence, it's been a challenge. First, before even China came into the picture, it was the colonizers. So be it for the Anglophone countries, the British, be it for the Francophones, the French. And this has had a grip on their economies so much so that they've not been able to go to they've not even near their potential. So what you're seeing is that now that China has come into the picture, China has done something slightly different. China is offering something that seems like a win-win. Mm-hmm. However, we need to determine...
Which is what?
So a win-win would be in the case of, whereas with most other partners, and here I'm just going to use China and the West.
Right.
And West, I'm just going to generalize everyone. So for the West, typically their development relationship for the longest time has been based on conditionalities. So whereas even if you look at when the structural adjustment programs were brought into Africa, it was, okay, cut down on public expenditure, cut down, so you can do this.
Okay.
China does not come with conditionalities for the most part. Mm-hmm. So China is saying, okay, we'll build this for you, we'll do this for you, this is the cost, this is what it's going to take, this is the duration. And sometimes most of it is actually done with free will. However, the free will then comes with a hidden cost. The hidden cost, which tends to be China tends to own certain critical resources, critical sectors in these countries. So the
own.
Yes. Okay. Own, I'm using own loosely here because most times it's true partnerships. But in a case where the Chinese company pretty much runs that sector, runs how that resource is extracted, I think at that point they pretty much own it. And recently, I think maybe less than 2 or 3 years ago, there was a case in, I think, somewhere in South Africa, around Tanzania or thereabout, where failure to pay some of their loans, the Chinese took over their port. And they took over the port for, I think it was 99 or 100 years. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the hidden costs associated with it. So when I'd say win-win is that African governments are looking at alternatives to the West. They're looking at alternatives to conditionalities because structural adjustment program did a lot of harm than it ever did good for the African continent. And if you even look at the history of the structural adjustment program, it wasn't designed for Africa. Mm-hmm. The initial design, the initial economists who came up with it was focusing on Argentina, Latin America at the time because of its debt crisis and monetary crisis at the time. And then eventually they were like, okay, well, let's use the solution for everyone. Right. And then it involves, cutting on expenditure, it involves privatization and things like that. You can only reach that stage when people are at a certain level of income. You cannot start privatizing healthcare when there are a lot of people who don't even have access to it, first of all, who don't have disposable income to access healthcare. So I think China is coming in a different lens. China is even giving things to Africa for free. And like I mentioned earlier, there are hidden costs because, for example, China is building roads. China is constructing schools. China is constructing hospitals. There is a Silk Road hospital in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which is very good, and it's a big hospital there, built by the Chinese. Even the African Union building was built by the Chinese. Wow. So China definitely has done quite a lot. And for some countries, they'll tell you China has done more for them in a short period of time than the colonizers did, than the Western powers ever did for them. You look at the DRC, for example, Belgium plunged resources from them. The DRC hasn't been able to progress. You look at West African countries, whether colonized by the British or the French. Most West African countries, the Francophone countries, are still tied monetarily, essentially financially, to the French. Right. So these are some of the implications that are holding them back. And this is why the China relationship seems better on paper, and some people would say it has impacted their lives much better than the Western powers ever did.
What are your personal thoughts on it? How do you feel about it?
So I think...
And if you had the ability to make a change on that, what would it be?
So I think my personal thoughts on it is that we need to revisit the relationship with China because it's not a 50-50. China definitely has the upper hand. Okay. What I would do if I was, say, a president or in some personal capacity would be to bring China to the table and see how we develop as partners in an equal almost equal, say a 55-45 at most, but a 50-50 ideally, but 55-45 type of relationship, whereas China benefits and we also benefit because China has shown that it's been able to lift millions
Sure.
of people out of poverty.
Right.
So that those are lessons we can learn from China. In addition to that, China has shown that it has the expertise to grow exponentially. So I think there are lots of opportunities to learn from China, and China has been willing to work with lots of African countries.
Absolutely.
So I think in my personal capacity would be to sit and renegotiate it so that Africa benefits more than it's doing.
Sure. Now, what do you think the future of renewable energy and sustainability looks like over the next 10, 20, or 25 years, let's say, in Africa?
I think the future is bright, but so far we're not showing enough light on it.
Do we see more conflict or less, in your opinion?
I think we'll see more conflicts in some way, more conflicts simply because you have vested veto players in the energy sector. And so if you take, for example, someone who imports generators, that person would not want a transition to renewable energy.
Absolutely.
That person or that company or entity would not want a transition to an energy that discards their business.
Sure.
So these are going to be strong lobbies. These are going to fight. These are going to support presidential candidates
Right.
and even fund conflicts.
Sure.
So I think we have to be very wary of that. However, I think, like I mentioned at the start, if investment is targeted towards renewable energy, is targeted towards developing infrastructure in local communities, I think we can definitely see a lot of potential in the next 10, 15, 20 years because I think we should be transitioning. We can no longer depend on fossil fuels. So I think we should be thinking of the future now and not still saying, oh, what do we do?
What sort of personal message would Francis want to share with our viewers on this platform?
I think the personal message would be that we can tackle the issue of climate change in Africa. We can tackle the issue of poverty. And I think we should tackle climate change by having poverty reduction strategies implemented. So they have to go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And I will just give a quick example. So for example, if you go to, say, rural Gambia where a woman is using charcoal to cook to survive, if you tell this woman to stop using charcoal, to stop using fossil fuels or whatever the case may be and transition, you have to provide for them.
Right.
You have to ensure that they can transition. You have to ensure that their life would not be worsened off.
Right.
So that means the poverty reduction aspect as well.
It's
So
already
I
hard
think
enough, so obviously that transition is not a priority.
exactly. It's not a priority. So I think we need to ensure that we also develop endogenous technologies that are in line with what the local communities need.
Absolutely.
What works in Nigeria cannot work in South Africa. What works in Ethiopia cannot work in Ghana. So we have to develop local solutions for local problems.
All right. Well, Mr. Francis, thank you very much for your time. Please do let me know when we can maybe have you once again here in the studio in Dubai.
Most definitely.
All right.
Thank you
Ladies
very
and gentlemen, there you have it. That was Mr. Francis Aoubi joining us right here at the studios. My name was Omar, and I will see you guys in the next episode of Trending Echoes. Thanks for joining us.